welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michael Bashshur. I'm an associate professor of organizational behavior and human resources here at SMU, and I'm also the academic director of the Masters of Human Capital and Leadership, which I'll return to in just a minute. Today, the structure of the talk today will be something like this. I'll tell you a little bit about me because it helps you understand where I'm coming from and maybe some of the biases that I have. We'll talk a little bit about what leadership is in the first place, and also the role of fairness in organizations, because to be able to talk about AI, leadership, and fairness, we need to have a common understanding of what leadership and fairness are in the first place. And then I'll end today with a very sort of brief, what can you do tomorrow type of thing, just so that tomorrow when you go into work or work from home or whatever it is you do, you'll be able to put something into practice from this talk. So, a little bit about me. I'm from Lebanon. I was born and grew up in Beirut, but also my mom was American. So I went and I studied and worked there for a while before moving to Singapore in 2011. You'll see there down at the bottom, those are two pictures of Lebanon. It can be quite beautiful. I'm an associate professor, as I said, of OBHR at SMU. I'm also the academic director of the Masters in Human Capital Management and Leadership, the MHCL here at SMU. And the reason I bring that up is partly because the way this talk is structured today is really how we talk about things at SMU, how our classes go. And also it is, as you'll notice, really what's called evidence-based. So it's based on the best science that we have now. And that's what we teach. We teach the latest science and also how to use, implement, and even in some cases, find your own science to help you guide your decisions at work. So, having said that, let me just jump right in. As I said, I'm from Lebanon, grew up in Beirut. Aside from being very beautiful, Lebanon can be extremely dysfunctional. We are probably an extremely high level of corruption in the government, lots of mismanagement, a lot of people in power, you would call them leaders, who have spent their careers basically fighting over resources and how to allocate those resources, and really not much fairness, and maybe a lack of ethics even. So that's where I come from. And as a consequence, probably I have this focus, this deep interest in what is good leadership, what is fairness, how do we understand what fairness is, what does it do, why is it important? Of course, as a broader scope, ethics in general, how do we improve ethicality, how do you understand ethicality, and related to all of that, the role of power in all of this. So you'll see those come up throughout the talk as we go through the talk today. Now, I am an academic, and as I said, I will be talking about the evidence, the science behind what we're talking about here. And I am proposing an answer. It's not necessarily the answer. Typically, I like to have a conversation about these things, have some back and forth. Obviously, in this case, it's not as easy. However, hopefully this conversation will trigger some ideas in your head and maybe even change the way you might do things at work. But to even begin this conversation, we need to have some common definitions, as I said. Definitions of leadership, fairness, and even, of course, artificial intelligence, because we all seem to have our own definitions, but we may not agree. So we have to come to some agreement first so we all know what we're talking about. Now, I know in most cases when I say, what is leadership? Lots of people have ideas, and when I do this in class, people will raise their hand and come up with lots of different ideas about what leadership is, but in reality, leadership is quite difficult to define precisely. There is a lot of research on leadership, what it is, what is good leadership, the effects of leadership, so on and so forth. But as Antonakis and Day said in 2017, it's actually really easy to identify in practice, but difficult to define precisely what it is. But at the core of any leadership, we can agree, I think, that it's an influencing process that occurs between a leader and follower. So what a leader is trying to do is to influence their followers to move in the direction that they think is best for hopefully the organization, and even at a national level, best for the nation. You're trying to influence people to move in the direction that you think is best. So that's a brief general definition of leadership. So if leadership is at its heart influence, and I would argue that it is, it becomes, of course, important to understand where influence comes from. Of course, a lot of influence stems from our ability as leaders to control resources, or sticks and carrots, rewards and punishments, right? That's the classic reinforcement theory, right? We get people to do things because we can reward them when they do the right thing, and we can punish them when they do the wrong thing. Of course, leadership is said to be bigger than that. Leadership also means having a vision, an idea of where you want to go into the future, and charisma, the ability to energize people to move in that direction. So it is more than that. In fact, we know a lot about charisma in particular. You can even train charisma in people. But for our purpose, let's talk about control over resources. This is the basic set of influence, or the basic source of influence that we have. Parents use it, even leaders use it, everybody uses it, right? So that's where we're going to focus on: control over resources, rewards, and punishments. Now, as basic as this is, it is rather tricky. When you do it right, and employees perceive fairness, perceive that you're doing things fairly, they perform better. They become more effective in helping, and they tend to volunteer more. These are what we call organizational citizenship behaviors. They do more of that good stuff beyond the core role of their job. They become more committed. They're willing to stay. They're willing to work longer and harder, and they're generally more satisfied. However, when you do it incorrectly, when you do it wrong, and the employees perceive you to be unfair, they become more likely to steal. They become more aggressive. They have stronger turnover intentions. They're more likely to leave. And they're more likely to engage in what we call basically the opposite of citizenship behaviors, counterproductive behaviors: lying, shirking, undermining, gossiping, so on and so forth. And there are tens, if not hundreds, of studies showing these relationships among fairness perceptions and these different types of behaviors. When it's fair, it's good. When it's unfair, obviously, bad things tend to happen. And this is basically because employees, when they feel like they're being treated unfairly, are trying to rebalance things, right? They're trying to pay back, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But before we do, we need to sort of understand, okay, if leadership is influence, then what is fairness? And again, there's a lot of work on what fairness is. It does vary between people and cultures, but at the core, what we find common across cultures, across organizations, is an emphasis on a few things. One is, let's say you're talking about a pay or promotion or whatever type of distribution that you're making. If that distribution is made fairly given the inputs and outputs. So given the amount of work I put in, do I deserve that reward, right? And that's actually what's called an equity rule. So inputs equal outputs, right? There's other rules for allocation: equality, where everybody gets the same, and need, where we give to people who need it the most. But for most organizational life, equity is sort of the rule. Are inputs equal to outputs? Am I getting what I put in, right? The other is the decision justified based on the information that's available? Right? So is the right information being used to make this decision? And that would go into sort of the input-output calculation as well. The other is the decision applied consistently? So is everybody treated the same way? Are everybody's inputs and outputs calculated the same way? And again, all these things might seem a little bit intuitive or obvious, but you'll see how it doesn't quite play out that way in the real world. The fourth is voice. Are people given voice in the process? So are people allowed a say in the way things are done, in the way allocations are made? Are they allowed a say in the things that are affecting them? Right. The last two are a little bit softer. The first four seem a little bit more obvious. The last two are what we call interactional justice, a subfacet of fairness. Decision makers communicate with honesty, transparency, and promptness, and they treat the people influenced by the decision with respect. So that feels a bit more touchy-feely, and you'll see, though, even though it's touchy-feely and soft, it's actually quite powerful, right? So let's talk about that in just a minute. But before we get there, why do people care about fairness? Well, if you think about yourself, if you've ever been treated unfairly, and think about the reaction that you have to that, the reason you are reacting badly to unfairness is because, well, first of all, if you're at work, this is where you spend the vast majority of your time, right? At least 8 hours a day. Now that many of us are working from home, it might be more or less, but it's an important place. It's a place where you get identity, where you get control, where of course you get money. So when you're treated fairly in this important sphere of your life, it gives you a sense of control and predictability. You know that if I do X, I will get Y, right? It also signals that in this place, it's very important to you. People value you. People who have power over you value you, your bosses, and your colleagues value you as well. And then finally, it signals that the organization as a whole adheres to an ethical standard, so that you work for an ethical company. And most people really, at the heart, want to work for an ethical company, want to work in a fair place. So that's a signal that we get from fairness, and that's why we care about it, at least in the organizational context, right? So turning back to this for just a moment, these were the criteria I mentioned. These last two, as I pointed out, these are what we call interactional fairness. Sort of soft, sort of touchy-feely, but this is where the leadership or the management people part really comes into the fore. This is the soft skills that many people don't get or sort of underemphasize. And I will point out in the MHCL, we pay a lot of attention to, but this is sort of the soft skills. So treating people with transparency, with promptness, with honesty, and with respect. That seems like it shouldn't matter that much compared to fair inputs and outputs and equity and that type of thing. But let me show you some of the evidence. This is a study by somebody named Gerald Greenberg, and he was working for a large manufacturing company that had multiple factories, multiple outlets around the United States. And at the time that he was working with them, they actually lost a major contract. So what had to happen was that two factories had to take a pay cut. The two factories that were supplying this client actually had to take a pay cut. The management went through, really crunched the numbers, tried to figure out how we can do this and what we need to do, and really the pay cut was the only answer. And that's sort of something that we're hearing a lot about even today in this day and age. So that was the decision taken in the organization. And what Greenberg said was, hey, okay, let me go to these two different factories. Let me see if I can show an effect for how we communicate bad news, basically a pay cut. If we communicate a pay cut fairly, will it have an impact down the line in how people behave in these different factories? So you have two factories, both of them getting a pay cut. But what was different was that in the first factory, when they communicated the pay cut, they took about an hour and a half in an all hands meeting, and they spent a lot of time communicating openly, transparently, and promptly. This is the sort of the text that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, right? Saying things like, lots of empathy, thank you all for being here. We're all getting a 15% cut in pay. Is it going to hurt? Of course. So that's empathy, that's respect. The decision didn't come easily, so on and so forth, right? This is temporary, we're all taking it, and they showed the numbers, they showed where the funds were going, where their funds were coming from, lots and lots of information, lots of respect, lots of transparency for an hour and a half, and then opened up to questions, okay? In the other organization, sorry, the other factory, they limited the explanation to 15 minutes. And this is the same information, right? So you see a thanking and in the 1.5 hour condition, thank you for your strength, et cetera, et cetera. In the inadequate 15-minute explanation, it was at the end of the shift foreman would just get up on a box, or the leader would get up on a box and say, listen, we all have to take a pay cut. Again, it's a 15% across the board pay cut. We're all taking it. This is the best solution, right? Thank you. If you have any questions, I can take 1 or 2 questions, but I have to go catch a plane and go somewhere else, right? So really abrupt, not a lot of transparency, not a lot of respect, not a lot of time spent explaining, right? So two different things, same 15% pay cut in the two conditions. And what do you see? So along the bottom there are the two different conditions. On the left is the 15-minute explanation. In the middle is the 1.5 hour explanation. And to the right is a third factory, what we call a control condition, where there was no pay cut, to show what happens when there is no pay cut, right? And the two bars you see, the red bar is the percentage of theft 6 months later, and the aqua bar is the percentage of turnover 6 months later. And take a second and look at it. But what you should see is a marked difference between the level of theft when you spend 15 minutes versus an hour and a half, right? So there's a decrease of theft of 23% when they spend an hour and a half. That's a huge drop in theft. In terms of turnover, you have a 16% decrease. So 21% in the inadequate explanation condition and 5% in the adequate explanation condition. And this is also why we have a control group. If you look at the control, they're also at 5% turnover. So that basically suggests that that's the base rate for this company across the factories. So in other words, we might be able to say that the adequate explanation condition had 0 turnover, right, as a result of this pay cut, right? Very soft and touchy, spending an hour and 15 minutes longer, giving respect, transparency, honesty, and you have this massive effect in terms of theft and turnover. Two very, very costly things for an organization, right? So that's not the only example. There are many, many more, but another one I'd like to show you is by the same author, Gerald Greenberg. In this case, he was working with a hospital conglomerate who had just bought out a couple of other hospitals, a chain of other hospitals. And this wasn't a pay cut because they lost a client. They actually, the conglomerate wanted to make more money, so they were cutting the nurses' pay. So not a very pleasant situation, but nevertheless, Jerry thought it might be interesting to again show the effects of interactional justice. In this case, training the supervisors of these nurses in interactional justice and sort of teaching them how to do it and how to manage in an interactionally fair way, and seeing if that ameliorates any of the effects of this pay cut, right? And of course, a pay cut is a very painful thing. If you've ever had your pay cut, I have. It's very painful. It's upsetting, and so this is showing how we might be able to ameliorate that type of thing. So what you see along the bottom axis is time, and along the upright axis, the y-axis there, is mean insomnia rating. So the average insomnia rating. They chose insomnia because obviously insomnia is an extremely important thing when thinking about the performance of nurses. It's one thing you don't want is a sleepy nurse, right? When your nurses and doctors are exhausted, they make a lot more mistakes. Yeah, but as I said, a pay cut is a very painful thing. It keeps us up at night. We mull over it, we fret over it. So there is a connection between these types of unfair, if you like, events and insomnia. What he wanted to show was whether interactional justice training of the supervisors could change anything. So what you have in these bars, or these lines, I should say, are 4 different hospitals. On the top line there is the underpaid, untrained. So this is nursing staff at a hospital. They got a pay cut and their supervisors were not trained in interactional justice. The line right below that is underpaid, they got a pay cut, but trained. So their nursing supervisors were trained in interactional justice. And the bottom 2 hospitals, those bottom 2 lines representing 2 hospitals, are where there was no pay cut. So these are 2 control conditions. And in one case, the nursing supervisors were trained in interactional justice, and the other, they were untrained. So these are 2 controls to show the difference. And as you move along the x-axis there, at time 1, everybody's about a level 3 of insomnia, so not 0, but not too horrible. There's a change in the pay system as you move from left to right? And then you see the spike in insomnia ratings right away. And at time 2, they're measuring insomnia, and you can see there's a significant difference. The nurses who had a pay cut are sleeping much less and much worse. Between time 2 and time 3, you see the interactional justice training kick in for the nursing supervisors, and they measure insomnia ratings again at time 3 and time 4. And what you notice, of course, is that for the people who got the pay cut, they're circled in blue, but had trained nursing supervisors, insomnia by time 4 is almost back down to baseline, while the people who did not have supervisors trained in interactional justice is still quite high. Right? So there's another effect on an important variable, insomnia for nurses, and something that's very important and practical to think about. Right? So at this point, I hope you're buying that justice matters, that fairness matters, and it can impact our work life and our work behavior in all sorts of different ways. And of course, I'm sure most of you think of yourselves as fair. I do, I think of myself as fair. But what's interesting about that is, as much as I try to be fair, I study fairness, I've been called out a number of times and told that I was being unfair. Right? So it's an interesting thing that most of us think we're fair, but in fact, we might not be seen as fair by our subordinates. And in fact, this was borne out by a study by Joel Brockner. He was following 400 managers and their peers and direct reports over the course of an organizational change process. And he asked the managers and their peers and direct reports all sorts of different questions, but it was only on one question where managers and their peers and direct reports disagreed. So he asked them, when managing change, I make extra efforts to treat people with dignity and respect, interactional justice, right? He asked the managers that, and they asked their peers and direct reports, when managing change, your manager makes extra efforts, right? And that was the only question on which there was wide, significant disagreement. Managers rate themselves up here, everybody else rated them a little bit lower, right? So they think they're fair, but they're not being seen as fair. And this is common, this is not unusual. And part of the reason is that it's hard to be fair. As easy as it sounds, you know, distributions, inputs and outputs, give people a voice, be honest, it's difficult. Frequently, there's not enough time to crank through all the information that's available and do a perfect input-output balance. or there's just simply too much information and you could never get through it all. You do have biases. We all do have biases, right? And it's hard to get around those sometimes. And one interesting thing is that most of us aren't fair because we don't like giving bad news. So we're actually good people, we're sensitive, and we don't like to give bad news. And in fact, that's unfair. So if you imagine the pay cut situation, that's a painful process for the employees, of course, but the managers have to stand up there and give people bad news and get all the bad energy, and people just don't like that. They avoid it. So instead, they'll just send them an email, right? Or do that, just a 15-minute presentation and just run away, right? So it's difficult being fair in the first place, even when you're trying as hard as you can. Worse is that people in power become even less aware when they're unfair. Partly, as you'll notice in just a second, because they don't get any information, right? So when you give people power, they tend to be less likely to take advice, but even more confident in their own choices. So therefore, they become less likely to be accurate. They're more likely to be inaccurate. And this is because when you have power, you tend to see yourself as independent and socially distant, because again, we depend on other people for resources, right? But when you have power, you don't depend on other people. You have the resources, you control the resources. So this egocentric bias is exaggerated. You focus on yourself and your needs. You pay more attention to information that is relevant to your self-interest. And people don't challenge you, right? Over time, you get accustomed to getting your own way. Few people challenge you. You get in the echo chamber. You start to hear what you want to hear. You only talk to people who agree with you, or the people who you surrounded yourself with are afraid to give you bad news. So only will hear the good stuff, so you become even less aware of your unfairness. Even if you're trying to be unfair, you'll be less aware. So that's fairness. So if leadership is influence, right, and leaders derive influence from the allocation of resources or other decision-making tasks, and if this is done fairly, it's highly motivated and derives superior performance, that's all great, but being fair is actually quite hard, even when you think you are or you want to be. And the more power you have, the higher up you are in the chain of command, the harder it will be to be fair, right? So it's harder to be influential. Okay? So what do we do? For a lot of people, AI seems to be a solution. Right? So is there a role for artificial intelligence here? Now, there's lots of different ways to define artificial intelligence, but again, we need to come to some sort of common definition. And the interesting thing about AI and HR is that there seems to be almost a natural match here. Like if you look at HR analytics or people analytics, the definition of that is using descriptive, visual, statistical analyses of data related to HR processes, human capital, organizational performance, benchmarks, so on and so forth, to enable data-driven decision-making. That seems like a perfect fit for AI, right? And in fact, given everything that I've said, this would suggest that, okay, if people are so flawed, let's just give it to AI, right? We don't have a lot of evidence yet, but studies are ongoing, and AI can be free from those managerial biases, right? So AI can remove those biases that we have a really hard time getting around out of the process. AI doesn't worry about giving bad news. It's not worried about the emotions coming back at it. Certainly is not worried about time constraints. It can crank while we're sleeping. And it has a very obviously great ability to process huge amounts of information. And beyond all that, algorithms, or like some that's one form of AI, do generally be experts in terms of making predictions and judgments. This might be a little bit of a sidetrack, but I just want to drive that point home. These decisions, when done by an algorithm, can be much better than the human decision, right? Intuitive judgment almost never beats a weighted regression in algorithm. And there's study after study after study about this. It's in all spheres, including HR decisions. A regression will beat intuitive judgment. But I just want to give you an example from bank loan officers because I think it's interesting. What they did in this one study was ask bank loan officers to predict which 30 to 60 firms would go bankrupt within 3 years of a financial report. So they gave them information about 30 to 60 firms and said, ask for whatever you want to ask for. So the bank loan officers requested different types of financial ratios, for example, liquid assets to total assets. They took all that information and they made a decision, right? The loan officers were correct 75% of the time, but a regression analysis of the ratios themselves was 82% accurate. So in other words, taking the information that the financial analyst asked for and just running that without the financial analyst's decision was accurate 82% of the time. The analysts, given that information, were only accurate 75% of the time. In fact, just one ratio, the ratio of assets to liabilities alone, predicted 80% by itself, right? And the reason for this is because even though the financial analyst knows what information to look at, as they put that information together in their head, their own biases and preferences and beliefs are coming into play, and they're weighting things less than optimally. A regression doesn't have those biases typically, and it just crunches those numbers and pops out with the answer. This is not to say that the analysts are useless. The experts are not important. Experts are great at telling us what variables are important in making the prediction, but combining these variables with a linear model is most frequently superior to the global judgment of those very same experts. And again, this is true for HR. This is even true for doctors, which is a bit scary to think about sometimes. So why not go to AI? Well, part of the reason is these algorithms, at least in an HR context, are being trained by people with biases, right? So the garbage in, garbage out model. Depending who develops or how you develop the AI, it could be just as biased as a manager or even worse because it doesn't know it's biased and try to correct that bias. There's these studies coming out on racist algorithms, right? Because they're coded on the way society sees race and culture and poverty and all this stuff, they come out racist. It's quite shocking. Joe Ito has been talking about this quite a bit, right? AI isn't magically going to make us wise. Our biases, if we put them into the program, AI will just amplify them. So the argument is that we need to fix these biases first, which is a very tall order, before we throw them into the AI. Right? But there are ways of training and doing better and recognizing the biases and reframing. There are ways to make these algorithms better, of course, and people are working on it. But you have to be really aware that these algorithms are very highly dependent on what you put on them in the first place. Okay? So if you go back and think about fairness and AI, well, an algorithm done well should be able to do these top three things quite easily, right? Because you're putting in the inputs and it's going to kick out the outcomes based on the rule that you give it. As long as you give it good information, right, it will apply it consistently. It doesn't care who is being applied to. So theoretically, an algorithm should do great here. And you could even get the people influenced by this process, the people who are impacted, right? Give them voice. Let them get them involved in the development of the algorithm. Tell them what you're plugging in. What are the numbers? What are the criteria that you're using? Give them a say. Talk to them about it, right? So you can even do that with an algorithm. The interesting thing that might be difficult for an algorithm are these last two. The very same things that we talked about before, having this huge impact, that soft skill stuff, being transparent, honest, empathic, respectful. That's difficult for an algorithm, right? And that's sort of what you see playing out. It's really quite interesting. Seem to like or trust algorithms, right? Google, and their people analytics team developed an algorithm to streamline promotion decisions for their software engineers. This should be the perfect group of people for an algorithm. That's what they do. They understand algorithms deeply, right? It didn't work. The engineers hated it. They had to abandon the algorithm. And part of the reason was that the engineers didn't like this. They didn't want a black box, which is a bit ironic because they actually they build these black boxes all the time. They understand these are the people who should be least likely to see an algorithm as a black box. But they said they didn't want to hide behind a black box. They wanted to own the decisions they made, and they didn't want to use a model, which is ironic. It's interesting though. Right? This is what we call algorithm aversion. Right? People generally prefer human decisions and predictions to algorithmic ones, despite the fact that the latter, the algorithm, has much higher levels of accuracy and less or no bias. Right? They prefer the human decision. When you use an algorithm in terms of layoff and promotions, they're seen as less fair than managers. A year-end annual bonus algorithm allocations. One of my students is working on this. The higher level of algorithm involvement, the less fair the process is deemed to be. human-only processes are perceived to be fairness, right? This goes back to why people care about fairness, especially this idea of control and predictability, right? They want to feel control. Those engineers in Google felt like, hey, this is a black box, we're losing control. But also they're missing that human touch, the sense of value, right? The people are valuing, whether it's a machine making it or an algorithm making decisions about you, you're getting none of those social cues about how you are valued, right? Again, the algorithm can do those top 4 things very well, as long as it's designed very well, right? But it's really up to the managers to manage the last 2, but also the voice process, right? So algorithms are not going to be good at soliciting voice either. So you have to really be involved as a manager, as a leader in the development of the algorithm and involving your people in the voice, giving them voice in the development. But then once decisions are made, the way it's communicated, the respect, the honesty, the transparency, all that stuff is the human touch, the leader touch, if you like, right? So ideally, you make the optimal allocations, decisions, assessments, you help build the algorithm with experts and those affected so they have voice, they're perceived as fair, right? But this one role for leaders that to date anyway cannot be seconded to AI, those soft skills, right? Managing perceptions, maintaining your influence, that's actually the hardest part, right? As I said, I study fairness and I get called out for being unfair, right? It happens to the best of us. It happens to everybody. It's a very difficult skill set to master. It's something you have to work at all the time as a leader, as a manager of human beings, right? And that's why AI will never fully replace HR and HR managers and leaders, but it can be used to supplement, to enhance, right? So that's my take for now on AI and HR and leadership and fairness. What I want to do before I end today is for you as a leader just to take something home about this. As a leader, if you're in the leadership space, you can think about your own fairness, right? As I said, it's difficult to be fair, and we frequently just assume that we're fair, and we might be even been doing everything very fairly, but we're not communicating it. So think about what you're doing. Are you actually fair? And if you think you're fair, how do you know? Is it because you're doing the right things? But are you getting feedback? Have you received any critical voice lately? Has anybody given you negative feedback? If you haven't, that should shock you. So if not, why not? What is it you're doing that is preventing you from hearing negative or critical voice? It might be that you're perfect, and if you are, good for you, but it's more likely that you're doing something to not receive that voice, right? And if that's true, what can you do about it? But if you are receiving critical voice, what are you doing with it, right? So part of voice, of giving people a say in things that affect them, is that you have to do something with it, right? If you get critical voice, you may not be able to do anything with it at all, right? But you need to be able to explain why you can't do anything with it at all. A very quick example here before we wrap up. I was working with a large organization, and it was a state organization working back in the United States. And we did a big survey with them, an hour long, with all their employees. And they sat for an hour filling out all this information. And we left a blank page at the back saying, if we missed anything, please tell us. And this one unit, the power plant unit, because this was a large organization that had their own power plant, the power plant unit said parking, the parking meters. All over their surveys on the back was just parking, parking, parking. We didn't understand what they were talking about. So we went to management and we said, what's happening with parking for the power plant folks? And they said, oh yeah, we know. The power plant runs 24 hours a day, which means that we need people here 24 hours a day. So we don't have parking space at the power plant, so people park in the street. And because they park in the street, they have parking meters there, so they have to pay to park. But remember, this is a state institution. So basically, these employees are paying the state to go to work for the state. Worse yet, at night, the night shift, they get in about 11, they stay till 6 or 7 a.m. There's nobody on the streets, but they still have to run out every hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on the meter, to put money in the meter to pay basically the state to go work for them. It drove them absolutely crazy. The managers knew this, and they had tried to fix it, but they couldn't, because parking and the money that they got from parking meters was in the transportation budget. The power plant is in the power budget or infrastructure or whatever you want to call it, two separate state budgets already allocated a year in advance. There's no way they're going to be able to pull money from this budget, plug it into that budget. It just wasn't possible. So what did they do? Nothing. They tried, it didn't work, so there's nothing they could do. The point they missed that you might be getting, if you go back and think about Greenberg studies, they never told the employees. They had done the best. They were actually objectively fair, but they forgot to communicate. So what we did was we had them do an all hands meeting with the power plant folks and tell them what happened. And they did. And by the end of that meeting, there were no more questions. Nothing changed. They still had to pay, but they weren't complaining about it. They understood, right? And fairness perceptions went up, right? So what can you do as a leader tomorrow? You can try asking your subordinates to begin a meeting by telling you one or two things that you're doing wrong or badly, or if you want to make it easier, that you might be able to improve on. Once you hear that feedback, act on it. Change, improve. If you can't change or improve, explain why you can't change or improve. If you can do that, their perceptions of your fairness will go up, even if you think you're being fair the whole time. And all the good things that come from fairness and the increase in influence that you'll have based on that will also go up. Again, I recognize this isn't as easy as it looks on the slide. My last story for today, I have a student, a PhD student. He knows that I tell this story, so he won't be offended. I did this with him. I told him, hey, you need to tell me what I'm doing wrong. And next meeting, I expect you to come in and tell me two things that I'm doing incorrectly or I could improve. He came to the next meeting and he didn't have anything to tell me that I was doing badly. So I asked him, okay, you didn't do it this week. Next week, I expect you to tell me two things that I'm doing badly. The next week came, he also couldn't tell me anything I was doing badly. So I said, I don't know what's happening here, but next week, I really want you to tell me a couple of things. So I get a message from him about midweek and telling me, Michael, listen, there's something you don't understand. I can't, my culture doesn't allow me to tell you you're doing something badly. You're the superior, I'm the subordinate. I can't, speaking upward like that is extremely difficult for me, right? So you're asking me to do something really difficult. That's what you're doing badly. So I took that feedback, I worked on it, and we actually developed a rapport over time where now he has no problem telling me when I'm messing up. And I try to adjust, but not always perfectly, of course, because it's difficult. So that's it for me today. I hope you took something from this. It sparked some ideas in your head. Maybe you can go out tomorrow when you're working from home and improve your fairness in general. And then think about what AI means to you in your organization, how you might adapt and use it to improve your own performance. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for joining. Stay safe, stay healthy, and goodbye. Thanks.